There we go.
Hello. Okay, I am not Craig Reed. I am John Buck, his infamous partner in crime, and I have taken over his channel just for tonight to host a conversation between myself and Trygve, who has also been on the channel before in our discussion on Jordan Peterson, and also Raymond, who is now the owl from Duolingo,
Yeah,
the meme owl.
everyone knows who. I must
Yes.
not let them find out. They must be murdered.
Yes, I am not the cat anymore. Thank you, Joe, from the chat. I actually have a face now. So yeah, you guys probably know me. John, been on the channel a couple of times before. There's Trygve from Germany and Raymond, who's just...
Oh, Norway.
Oh, you're not in... Oh, you're in Norway. Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
It's
All
fine.
right. And yeah, Raymond, who's joining in, he's been on Twitter. You guys might know him. He likes to pester everyone.
Okay, John, let's calm down for a bit. Let's take it easy.
All right. So the topic of tonight's discussion, I had a bit of a Twitter thread discussing the topic of meaning with somebody, whether meaning was a nominal kind of byproduct of the brain, just in the same way, or kind of an impression of our own subjective fantasies, something like that. And I analogized it to our perspectives of within a dream. Whether or not, okay, so the discussion was whether or not meaning was an actual objective thing that we can perceive and be incorrect about, or whether it is something subjective, like a subjective relay of our own internal impressions. And from my understanding, if it is purely subjective and only a byproduct of our own minds, then there is no way in which we could be incorrect about what was or isn't meaningful to us. So the intense sense of meaning that you might get from, say, taking drugs, something like that, that those generally will express that magnificent sense of meaning and flow state and all that. That's something that I at least see would be a subjective, incorrect apprehension of meaning, because it is a subjective state that has no bearing upon actual reality. Okay, and that was just kind of where we started. And then from there, Trygve brought into the discussion how to, instead of using the dichotomous terms of objective and subjective, just because there's certainly the subject that is experiencing all of reality. So like, even as a subject, I'm experiencing objective reality as well as subjective reality, my internal impressions of the external world, as well as my own internal impressions of my internal world that we have. And so it seems like meaning is kind of a interrelation between this subject and him acting within the world. And so maybe having these dichotomous terms of, oh, it's objective out there or it's internal in here, is something that isn't quite a good category to put the phenomena of meaning within, just because it's something in between those two things. And so Trygve, he had a addition to the thread. You want to go into that, Trygve? I'm trying to find it exactly.
Yeah, I think I'm going to bring it up too, just to make sure I don't misremember here.
Mm-hmm.
But the main point I was making, if I remember correctly, was something like that the meaning is always going to be relative to the goals, because meaning, as I understand it, is implication for action. It's what something means. It's why you care about it, because it has something to do with what you're doing or what you want to do. So with that in mind, it's always going to be relative, but it's depending on the relationship, as you said. So I think I think that was a good summary. But on top of that, I suggest that it might be better to think of it as actual or derived. And
Yeah.
you wanted examples on that?
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah, No, go
I
ahead.
tried to bring up some examples, but because meaning is such a fundamental thing when you're looking at it as implication for action, basically everything is an example. So maybe first I'll go into the thing I brought up first, which is the abstract concept. We have the actual meaning, the meaning that is signaled from the world, for lack of a better word. It is the meaning. It is the meaning that is accurate with regards to your goals. It is what you need to know to reach the goals. It's what you need to know about the implications for action. It's what you need to know about what you should be doing, essentially. And then there's the derived meaning, which is the meaning of that you pick up, which might be completely off base, but it's what you pick up about it. And it is capable of misfiring, but it has. We have every reason to think, from what I can see at least, that it's evolved to be an accurate system to identify it.
Yeah.
So that's a rough summary.
Uh-huh. And I think my first apprehension towards this was the use of the word actual there, because I can certainly see instances where meaning is being actually actively put out by, say, interactions with other parties. So like when you're actually interacting with another person, they have an intention within their words, and so there's meaning behind the symbols of the words that they use, the noises that they make, and then you as the active recipient to hearing them, you can attain a close approximation of the actual intent behind that. Whereas when you're interacting with the world, it's not like the world itself is speaking a language to you, but rather we are interpreting the world through our own lenses. And I don't know, it seems like the use of actual is something that is only going to be it's only going to be accurate when it's relaying information from a source that is outputting intent within it, or has some sort of like accurate meaning or information within it.
When we know there's an intent behind it, you're saying. So when we have something else that is aiming towards the goal, but that's the thing. It's dependent on the goals you are pursuing, not the goals the other eventual agent is pursuing.
Okay, so in regards in the actual, so like actual meaning is still your goals that you have in mind, and then the meaning that you're deriving from reality in relation towards achieving those ends.
Yes.
That would be actual meaning as it's being perceived by the individual.
No,
whereas,
that's derived. The actual is the meaning that would be picked up if it was accurate, which it should be close to, but it's not going to be completely accurate. So, for example, our interpretations of religion and so on, with concepts of agents acting out there, for all we know, it might be derived and just brought along because it has worked.
mm-hmm.
So it's got nothing to do with any other agent. It's just the meaning relative to your goals. And the meaning you pick up, again, is derived. I have a hard time finding better terms for this right now, at least.
Yeah.
So because it is relative to the goals. Derived because it is what you pick up relative to the goals.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of where I was a bit confused, because it seemed like there would be no way for you to determine whether or not something was actual or whether it was derived, because all meaning that you're apprehending is going to be derived through your own meaning-making system that you have in place, your value hierarchy that you're interacting with the world with. And it's I don't see how you can make, like, where would you be able to distinguish the difference between actual meaning and derived meaning?
Well, that's the thing. You can't, which is why it's a useful distinction.
Well, if you can't make the distinction between the two, how is it a useful distinction?
You can't distinguish this, but you can make the distinction to keep in mind that you can be wrong, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah, I get that for sure.
The point was that it was going to be a useful distinction, after all.
Say that again.
The point is to make a useful distinction, right?
Mm-hmm. So, as maybe the only way to make the distinction between actual meaning and derived meaning is through post hoc analysis from putting. This is maybe bringing in my definitions or my two contradictions, or not contradictions, my two different systems for meaning, with actionable or non-actionable. And as I see it, you can have your derived meaning, where you're perceiving this object, let's say, as bringing you closer towards your goal, and you put that idea into action, and then as you do so, and let's say you achieve your goal, this retroactively tells you that this belief was more actual than it was merely derived.
Yeah, I think that's about as close as you can get to it, which is why, as you said before the conversation started officially, we're probably more on the same page than we're not.
Yeah, and maybe that's it, because the word actual there has very much the, I guess, scientific realist idea behind it, where you have actual things and non-actual things, whereas from a subjective impression, or from a derived sense of meaning, there's no way, in fact, to get a full sense of whether or not something is actual in regards to your goal, or if it is just a, I guess, subjective impression.
Let's say inaccurately derived.
Yes, or that it's inaccurately derived. Except for, and this is where I bring in my definitions, how effective it is at achieving that goal. And so that, at least, maybe the two can pair onto each other, where having your sense of this being an actual connection to your goal in some way or not, and then putting that into practice, the way to distinguish between an actual meaning and derived meaning from, or incorrectly derived meaning, is how effective that meaning is at attaining that goal that you have in mind.
Yes, I think that's about as close as we can get.
Mm-hmm.
Which is part of the problem and part of why we need to rely on some kind of existential pragmatism.
Yeah, that's the thing. I've been, I don't know, lately I've been a little more critical, I guess, of pragmatism. Just there's a couple of things from I guess ethicalist, or what is it, deontological ethics, that is not to do with the consequences of an action, but more to do with doing these ethics just because they are more morally right for what you're to be doing. Because that way you're not like taking the Thanos route of no spoilers, of course, just that the ends, achieving the ends always justify the means of doing so. And so by holding up a certain set of ethical principles for yourself, then that, I guess, kind of protects you from falling outside of the realm of unethical behavior, just so that you can achieve your ends that you have in mind. But that's probably a side discussion.
Yeah, I think it is, but we can delve into it for a bit. So, so the thing about pragmatism is that no one's saying it's a good solution. I just don't see how we have anything better when it comes to figuring out what is actual.
Yeah, and yeah, that's the thing. Like William James' book Pragmatism, it's such a thin book, but there's a lot to it, and a lot of what we're talking about here is directly related to that, where when you have some sort of disagreement about whether a thing is or whether it's not. So like one of the examples he uses is the free will, whether we have free will or we don't have free will. Since it's something kind of metaphysically outside of our ability to determine whether or not we do or we do not, the way that you can get for those instances where we have no method of distinguishing the two, there is always the way of, I guess, getting a better sense for whether this thing is actual or not, or whether that's the thing. It might not even be actual, but it might be still more practical to put the belief into practice rather than to agree with it. So William James, his kind of, I guess, rebuttal to determinism is that he has the subjective impression that he does have free will. And so he is going to act upon that as if he does have free will. Otherwise, he was just deterministically determined to believe he had free will. There was some other way that he actually set forward, but I don't know. It might be too late at night for me to get a good remembering for his exact, I guess, argument for free will. But it was all done in a way that not actually trying to like metaphysically or ontologically prove that we have some sort of like immaterial soul or something like that. Rather, it was just the putting of this idea into practice actually made the belief itself more true in a way. Just because it basically, it's kind of like an axiom that we have to take on just in order to act within the world in a way that is, I guess, kind of rational or intelligent, just to kind of have this belief that, yeah, I'm an agent that has capabilities and actions. And just because we have a mind that thinks this, at least. And so like just letting our mind follow through with this belief gives it, like, maybe that's the mind's purpose, is to actually put these put into practice, or to really to make distinguish between possible choices and then follow through with some of those choices, even if it's all causally determined. It's still almost like a necessary fiction for the mind to believe in, just in order to put forward to go through this causally determined choice space. I don't know.
Two things there, I think.
Yeah, go ahead.
Two things there. So first, the way I would argue for free will is very similar. I haven't read anything of William James. I'm in fact very, very much illiterate on these people. I've just tried to reconstruct it in my own head. But I would argue like this: we can't tell the difference. So instead, we should look at what works, or what assumptions lead people to make terrible decisions. In a deterministic way, you might even say. So that's essentially the same thing, I think. But the second point was something to do with the. I think I lost it.
Okay.
It's early in the morning here. I have an excuse.
Yeah, it's like late here, 1:30 a.m. for me, and early in the morning for you. Raymond, did you want to add anything to this?
Well, I was thinking of adding something, but then your conversation was going so fast, I decided, you know what? If I say anything stupid, everyone's going to be mad. So I decided to shut up.
Oh, no.
But it was very interesting. It's like I can see where your arguments and axioms are starting to coalesce, and it doesn't seem like you disagree on anything. And I did warn you guys, this shouldn't turn into a Zizekian conversation where it's a supposed debate, and then in the end you're both like, I agree. No, you agree. No, I agree. And it happened anyway.
I don't think that's where we're going. I think we knew we pretty much agreed on this. It was just trying to figure out the terms.
Well, actually, this is a good thing. So far we didn't end up in some kind of a abyss of like disagreement. We decided upon our definitions and our axioms. Well, we could take the idea a bit further, if you wish.
Oh yeah, how so?
Hmm?
Bring it further. Like to further extrapolate onto our kind of shared agreements here.
Yeah, well, maybe we could form like a meta-ethical system for like examining these sorts of things. I brought metaphysics in. I did it. Oh no. But it's a good idea that pragmatism is something we have that's quite useful, and it is a good system for deciding based on actions. And since we can't go around making moral assumptions or moral axioms for other people, a baseline level of agreement or some kind of like a let's say a rock to build our house upon, if I'm quoting Jordan on this. So we can decide on that.
Yeah.
It would solve a lot of what to say disagreements, because we might think we disagree, but in reality we just agree, and it's just semantics.
Yeah, that's the thing with people using their own definitions.
So far I haven't seen any major contradictions in both of your logic. It seems like you're two sides of the same coin, just you're approaching it from a slightly different way. It seems fine.
So I think I remembered what I was going to mention just a moment earlier. It had to do with deontology, and well, I absolutely agree that there are certain problems with unfettered pragmatism, but let's not forget that our traditions have worked in the past, and they are carrying a lot of propositions about what should be done just because. So some humility with regards to that is probably in order.
Yeah, that's kind of the thing. We can, when we have the idea that a certain action will lead towards the end goal that we have in mind, then that almost like gives us the justification for putting that action into practice. Whereas that's the thing, like we're always at a constant limited knowledge to the point where, like, for all we know, by putting this action into practice, there might be certain ramifications that were outside of our scope of knowledge that actually come in conflict with our intended goal that we had in mind. So like even just like we exist within a social group, and so if we within our social groups there are certain ethical norms that are put into place, and so I might be like away from the social group and think that, okay, by killing this one person right now, I can do something that benefits the whole group. Like I can kill this bum right here and harvest his organs and then save like 3 other people in my group. And nobody will know about it. But that's the thing, like I can't know that nobody will know about it. And it might be that by putting that action into practice, then if it were to be found out, I could be like arrested and like ostracized from the group for infringing upon that homeless person's right to life. Just as like one example.
Yeah. Again, 2 things. Again, first of all, I just point back to what I said earlier. I didn't say pragmatism. I said existential pragmatism. I think the existential element is really important too, because we live in existential bubbles. We don't understand what's outside the bubbles. That's the unknown. And we have no idea what it means, so we should be a little careful.
Yeah.
I think Camus would agree with you. Albert Camus, the guy who is one of the few existentialists who correctly pointed out that you can use nihilism to avoid responsibility in a weird way. Like I assume you guys have read The Stranger. Is that in the book?
Yeah, I've read The Stranger.
Yeah, in the book you can see him change his mind from like following group norms to just dismissing everything as this doesn't matter, that doesn't matter. So then he goes further and further, and finally he kills a man. Sorry for the spoilers, but that's like that. That's a point similar to John's. He makes an assumption, and upon which he uses that assumption to justify his actions. But he doesn't stop there. He just moves on and on, and he includes as many actions as he possibly can and justifies it under one assumption, as in, does anything have meaning? Does anything have value? Or does anything have purpose? It's you can have iterations of that.
Or,
So you,
or to put it in the terms we've been using here, does anything imply something as to what I should be doing?
yeah, that's another way to put it as well. So you can see the errors in his logic. First of all, he makes a false assumption. Then he makes an action which actually happened, which is reality, based upon a false assumption. Well, we can argue about the justifications for the action, but we can see that he has not built a stable system of meaning. The funny thing is, his denouncement of meaning gives him meaning. That's like an irony over there. You can see that. It's quite interesting.
It's the same problem we have with beliefs. We can, if you say you don't believe in anything, you can ask what makes you believe that. It's the same problem.
Yeah, I didn't want to enter the religion area because that's like a hot spot, and I'm a bit confused as to the whole situation because I'm an object of.
Everyone should be confused about the whole situation.
Yeah. We all should be confused about God and religion. It will make everyone's job much more easier.
What you said there, Raymond, is actually quite good because next Thursday, not this, or either Thursday or Friday, we haven't set down a perfect date yet. I'll be debating biblical history skeptic. Yeah, regarding moral nihilism, and that your reasoning there is something I was planning on going into. That the very act of determining that there is no objective meaning relies upon certain evaluative assumptions. And so you can say that these assumptions are merely subjective impressions or subjective ideas, but
or ideals.
But then you by doing so, you kind of give up your right to rationality because you're using arbitrary evaluative structures from your own subjective impressions to say that there's no actual correlation between your evaluative structures to the objective world. So like just in order to like determine something as being more true than not true, you have to have certain estimations of value placed into certain senses or faculties. Say like my waking experience has a higher priority of truthiness for me than my dreaming experience, because when I'm dreaming, things are much more confusing. And so just by putting more weight on my waking experience is a form of assumptions of truth value assigned to those experiences to a greater degree than the truth value I assign to my dreaming experience. Kind of like what I talked about earlier regarding meaning, whether meaning is more objective or subjective. Like when I say something is meaningful, am I just relating a subjective impression or opinion that I have towards another thing, or am I actually relating like am I referring to an actual objective correlation between this thing and objective reality, and like how the two are connected in some way? So like, and that's probably how I will be arguing, is more from a pragmatic perspective, where there is an objective relation between the value that I place in a thing and how well I can achieve my goals through that evaluation.
Yeah, but first we have to define meaning for him so he agrees, or you'll get nowhere.
Yeah, I don't know if we're going to actually go into meaning, but we're definitely going to be going into value. And so there we'll have to go into exactly what we mean by value, because like for me, anything that gives you a not an obligation, but a
implication.
Yes, an implication towards certain actions over other actions is to me a it is a reference of what your estimated value of that thing is. And that's the thing, like, if this is, I think, where my case is perhaps strongest. I don't know, maybe you guys can push back on this, because as I see it, if it is the case that evaluative statements are only referring to our own subjective impressions to those things, there's no way in which our evaluative statements can be incorrect, because I'm only referring to my own mental states, and like that, unless I'm like somehow mistaken about what I'm thinking, which is kind of not, I don't know, that would be a much weirder thing to argue. I think when we have a perception of whether something is valuable or not, we have the expectation that our mental state that we have is correlated to that object in an objective way. And that's why I think we can be incorrect for certain things. So like, I have the subjective impression that this let's say this lottery ticket will be my ticket out of small town USA, something like that. And so I have a belief that I will be acting upon and an estimation of value within this lottery ticket, believing that it's going to be the winning lottery ticket. And I can act on that belief up to a point when the actual lottery numbers come out and I see, oh, this isn't actually the lottery ticket. So all of the high estimation of value I had in this lottery ticket was proven incorrect through putting that practice into putting that belief into practice. Whereas if my estimations of value for this lottery ticket were only in regards to my own subjective experience, I don't know.
It doesn't make much sense, is what you're getting at.
Yeah. I cannot see how we can ever be incorrect about our estimations of what is valuable,
unless there's something outside the self. Here I want to bring up a point which might support your case, and which also challenges what is subjective precisely, because it's not clear to me that you can control your own mental states. And if you're just going by that, you still can't control it. It's part of how I argue for there definitely being more in existence than just me. When I think about things in terms of ontology, I'm not the only thing that exists, because I can be annoyed whether I want to or not.
Yeah, I kind of have that same. That's kind of like my own mental case against solipsism, is that I have the experience for when I am the master of my own thoughts, and that is actually when, or a close approximation to that, is when I'm actually dreaming. So that's the thing. When you're dreaming, when you have an impression of something, that impression directly leads into another impression, and it's like this one continuous flowing river of thoughts and impressions that all go into each other. Whereas when we're awake, it's not like we can be kind of like surprised by things, and I guess you can kind of be surprised within dreams as well. But
yeah,
I don't know.
I think a better perspective on dreams would be something like you don't have a continuation of the same dream every night.
That's
but you
true.
do have.
Say that again.
I said that's. Oh wait, you're talking to Trygve. I'm going to call him Trygve. I prefer it that way. Continue, man. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Okay, I think, but my point here was that when you're dreaming, you don't have the same dream every night. You even have several dreams in one night, according to research anyway. So
the research states
because
that
you have a continuation of your waking life every time you wake up, you have more reason to think that it is more real than you have of dreams.
Mhm.
Because the dreams, they don't necessarily come back, or they do come back, or they left for something completely new to come instead.
Or you can also distinguish between reality and the dream by pointing out the inaccuracies in the dream. Like for example, they tell you to spot if you're dreaming, they tell you to pinch yourself or think of a clock or something like that because your brain can't process all those details. So now when you're in a dream, when what you think, for example, I've had dreams where I'll just think of something stupidly and it'll actually come to life. I'm like, this makes no sense. This isn't supposed to happen. Why am I here? And then I'll just snap out of it. I'll just wake up and I'm like, oh, it's a dream.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I
Why?
don't think that's a stronger case because then you have because then you're asserting that it's not, and that leads to confusion, and you're basing that off of other assumptions.
Yeah, it's all assumptions. I won't disagree. So your critique for dreaming is it if it repeats or if it changes details or it won't be the same thing over and over again. Am I getting that right so far?
No, not quite, because my point is more that when you're trying to figure out what is more real of dreaming and waking life appears to continue every single day, whereas dreams, they come and go and change in many different ways.
Yeah, correct.
It's a pretty strong case of one being a continuum and the other one not being one.
I see. Yeah. So like waking life kind of has a better sense of continuity between the same days, whereas each dream is kind of its own thing or a recurring dream
element.
that you might have.
Yeah,
Yeah,
perhaps
that's a
some
good.
elements changing.
That's a good point, really, because dreams usually don't continue very much. You just shift from point to point, and that should tell you the fact that it makes no sense at one moment you're on top of a mountain, and the next moment you're underwater.
Yeah,
So,
I actually have a vivid example of something like that with a dream I had sometime during high school, where I was switching between two scenes. One of them inside the high school building, where instead of the main center of the building, there was a giant playground labyrinth thing, and the other part was alone in the middle of the desert. It was a pretty interesting set of two pictures, but they were alternating in a really strange way.
Interesting.
so if the desert scene never showed up, you would have believed you were actually in the high school.
No, I wouldn't, because it wouldn't have continued when I woke up. It wouldn't have
Yeah.
continued the next night.
Yeah, that's for sure. But the funny thing is, it's how weird is the fact that dreams are very, very similar to real life in certain examples. So you actually think you are in real life, and then it'll just snap out of it for some weird reason. Continuity, as you mentioned.
Yeah, it's weird, but I suppose it's something you just get used to, right? As a human, it's kind of hard not to.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, to add on to John's point, I think lucid dreaming is even weirder than regular dreaming. Like I lucid dream a lot. I really don't know why I do that, but I know I'm in a dream. I'll just think of something stupid, and the dream will just act out that reality, that whatever I've thought about. And then the moment I get really disconnected from the idea that's being presented, that's when I'll wake up, usually. So it's kind of weird. So like usually dreams are stated as things that are out of your control. They just mix up all your emotions, feelings, experiences into one distilled package. And they're trying to tell you something. And this is all Jordan Peterson's argument, none of mine, because frankly, I'm not a psychologist.
Well, it's Freud's argument, I think, developed by Jung.
Yes, Freud's argument. But there's lots of holes in it as well, according to cognitive scientists. Like, for example, Jordan's point is that a dream is trying to tell you something important when you wake up and something you didn't understand before clicks for you. It all comes together in a piece. So that's trying to, it's a very Freudian argument that's trying to say you're collating all the experiences you have into an understandable set of scenes or actions or perspectives. It has to make sense, or it has to explain something you never understood before. That's his argument for pointing out that yes, dreams are not gibberish that your brain rewires constantly. It's trying to tell you something.
And that's more Freud, correct? Because Jung, according to Peterson again, developed this by saying No, it's not that. It's not that the brain is making something coherent and meaningful to teach you something or anything. It's that the brain is doing the best it can, which is not necessarily good enough.
Yeah, that's the point. But the issue is that that argument is that why not present something in more bits and pieces in a more coherent scale than mix up random mythological elements and all sorts of personifications to get a point across. I mean, we don't know for sure because that's the area where biology and
Yeah.
subjectivity and objectivity are completely in the gray areas. Any single claim that's made about the area usually gets defeated, biologically speaking. But subjective claims are actually more valid because it rejects objectivity. I'm trying to make sense of that line of thought.
Yeah, I think I remember Peterson saying how Freud's theory of dreams was that like the unconscious had like the answer, but it wrapped it up into a kind of symbolic impression to tell your subconscious as you're dreaming. Whereas I think
repression. Repression is a big theme in Freud, correct? So perhaps not to tell.
Yeah, and then but Jung's kind of, I guess, evolution of that is that the unconscious itself doesn't know what the problem is, and it is making its best bet based upon kind of similar but disconnected, let's say, errors in our worldview, and then they amalgamate all of those errors together into something novel and I guess strange, and then that is kind of the main subject of the dream, kind of like an amalgamation of all of these different things that are kind of outside of our scope of understanding, and then trying to fit them all together into something so that they have some sort of salience, I guess.
And sometimes you have dreams that make it really easy to believe that, like the vivid dream I was referencing a little earlier about the playground labyrinth inside the high school and the desert. Those two pictures, I have a pretty good idea about what could be meant by them, especially considering the time at which it happened. I don't think that's a subject to go further into right now, though, because it's a big one, containing a story, and I don't think this is story time.
Usually, dreams tend to do that a lot. You know, they'll take huge experiences you've had, and then it'll take a long time for you to spaz out the details, and you're stuck with that one dream as a representation of everything that's happened with that situation.
Yeah, and it was a really good representation of that situation, in my opinion, at least that dream.
Well, we can't be sure unless someone has had an account of everything you've said and done so far, and they compare it with the dream's representation and your representation, your perception. Then possibly we could see how close it matches. But hey, it's all subjective here, so let's not get too far into that.
Yeah, that's a subjective judgment for sure.
Mm-hmm. As being like kind of three kind of attempting artists, I see a strong connection between how we dream and how we, or at least how it seems like artists kind of produce their work. Just how they take the kind of outskirts of our knowledge and then try to fit them together into something. I don't know. I guess to relate something of my own work, I had this story and I built it up over probably about 4 months or so, and really enjoyed it. But it wasn't until after I had finished it and then went through sort of an analysis did I come to realize that the story and the main character in the story was a reflection of my own like ideal person that I wish to become. And in a way, it also had kind of this abstract strategy for myself in how to become that ideal person as well. And I don't know, it seems like that's kind of like, I actually wrote a tweet something about this also, where the art is always the psychoanalysis of the artist themselves. and then the
I saw
artist
that.
themselves, it is the psychoanalysis for the culture that he belongs within.
Yeah,
And
that's actually pretty accurate. Yeah, I had the same experiences.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, there's
Who is this?
Cafe from. Is that how you pronounce it from the chat?
Yeah.
Howdy.
Hey,
Hello.
hey, what's up, guys?
Hmm.
I
Yeah,
really,
what's up?
I really like the discussion you guys got going. Especially the topic of meaning. I don't know if you consider what you guys been discussing right now as a digression, but like the actuality that you were talking about. I was going to ask you if you ever heard of the idea of the philosophical absolute.
Like with Platonism or idealism?
It's related to that. There's this notion in philosophy, you can find it in Greek philosophy, where like Plotinus, the early Plato, they considered the absolute basically all that, the sum of all that what can manifest in material reality. The sum of anything that can actualize in material reality, as opposed to someone's opinion of something that can't happen in the laws of physics. And so they made that's the distinction. You remember you were trying to find a distinction yourself, and I know, man, I'm sorry, the other, I know you're John, the other speaker.
Yeah, Trygve?
Yes, he was saying that, well, that's as far as we can go. But no, I think they have gone further. I think philosophers have made distinctions beyond that, And I mean, that's one thing I wanted to add. And I mean, there's other things, like it's not just an absolute in conception, in your mind, in the intellect. It's something that they experience firsthand by direct experience, or what they call mystical experience. Was a direct experience of the absolute, so that when mystics describe these experiences, they talk about being outside of space and time, as being everything at once. And so they had they didn't only conceptualize it, but they had a direct experience of it, and that's where their philosophy drew upon. And I mean, and what accompanies this is an experience of like unconditional love, which directed. So I mean, if we're going to talk about the energy, what actualizes, this is the principle of what directs it forward. And so, and I think a lot of religions, a lot of the major religions draw from that core. And I don't know if you've ever seen it that way.
Yeah, it's probably what was drawn on, but I have to say that I don't see how this brings anything certain beyond derived meaning.
It definitely does have the, I guess, intense salience in comparison to like commonplace living, where this encounter with the absolute is something so far outside of our normal ways of interacting with the world that it
hang on.
Oh, is my mic messing up?
No, you're good, man. I can hear you fine.
I can hear you as well.
I can't, but I noticed something else.
Okay.
So it just occurred to me that this absolute might just be exactly what is symbolized by the Dragon of Chaos, because it's the totality of everything.
Yeah, the Ouroboros. I get it.
Well, the Ouroboros is a very early symbol for eternity, the never-ending eating of its tail. I mean, lots of religions express that symbol. It doesn't have an origination. A lot of religions were expressing these concepts through those symbols. Snakes are recurrent throughout, Amazon.
Yeah. And there are probably reasons for that. Yeah.
Yes, and I've always wondered about it myself, but no, there was another aspect that I wanted to add, but to that, but I can't recall it right now. I got nervous, man. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that it's hard to like these spiritual encounters that people have with that which is, let's say, transcendent to our own common ways of dealing with the world. It seems like it's
or language,
never quite expressible in like words exactly.
Yeah.
Like every time we speak about it, we kind of are. It's almost a degradation of the actual experience.
Well, I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with this, studies going on in Johns Hopkins where they're giving people a single dose of psilocybin, a single high dose. And when they come out of this experience, they do try to get an assessment right when they come down. And but most of the time it's ineffable for them. They have no words. It doesn't matter how much they've been studying words. They can know the whole dictionary and they still have nothing to say. And they follow all of these volunteers along, of course, and they do follow-ups and interviews, and finally after like a year and a half they finally have something to muster and say about that experience. But it took that long to mull it over. And and these are studies that are happening right now. I don't know if you're aware of them. And I think the point I was going to try to make earlier was that they're relating these experiences to, what's been spoken about in all the major religions. So like in Christianity, in Christian mysticism, you have the beatific vision or theoria. And in Buddhism, you have nirvana. In Hinduism, you have samadhi or Brahman. In Taoism, you have wu wei. In each of the major religions, you have a term that points to these involvements of these mystics and engaging these altered states of consciousness or these transformations of consciousness.
In 3 words, union with God, something like that.
Yes, a union. So you were talking about earlier subjective experience, and it's a weird criticism to say that it's something that's subjective, because what it's kind of overlooking is all experience is subjective. Like there's nothing that you can't have that's not subjective. So the interesting thing that happens in these experiences is that the subjective subject object duality that we all experience in our everyday consciousness of being the separate entity, the organism, separate from the environment, that duality completely dissolves at the height of these experiences, where there's no distinction between the subjective and the objective. They're one and the same. You could say everything's objective or everything's objective, and there's no distinction in that state. And that's why it's so hard to talk about. And that's why mystics, you can read their writings, but unless you've had it, it may sound like gibberish to you. It may sound like alien language that they're speaking, but I really think they're trying to describe these experiences.
Yeah, they probably were.
Yeah, I would too. If I met God, I'd be like, hey, I met the guy. And then everyone's like, why are you talking about ice cream? So, yeah, that would happen. But to be serious, you're right. Like Jordan does mention a point where if you're at the center of the line between the yin and the yang, or the Tao Te Ching, that's where you want to be. I think at that LSD experience, you achieve that state of flow, or you can call it a prophetic vision. Jordan describes it as that at times. It's where you have no more idea of what is clearly defined. There is no more object. There is no more subject. You are one and all. It's a Hinduistic thing. It's a Taoistic thing. It's in lots of religions, especially in Eastern ones, where they're trying to. Their idea of God is not a being. It's more of everything. Is the best way I can describe it.
Yes, or the Tawhid in Islam or Sufi mysticism. It's described. They also say fana. I really like the term fana. It means, it translates to die before you die. To have the ego death before you actually die. So oftentimes when these mystics have these experiences, they completely lose their fear of death, because they have an understanding of reality out of that experiences that completely just evaporates their any conception of death for them. The term no longer makes sense.
Because death is no longer finite. It's infinite.
Yes. It's very different from them. Yeah.
And Michael Pollan, I haven't read his book, but I know he talks about this. He had a kind of similar thing where after having gone through ego dissolution, he no longer feared death because he had the understanding that, I guess, consciousness can exist without there being an ego.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I love that dude, man. I think his book was How to Change Your Mind, and he talks about interviewing. I've read it, by the way, and he talks about interviewing this one chick named Dina Baser, and she was one of these cancer patients involved in these studies, and she was, she's on the brink of death, fearing death. She can't even have lunch with her family because death is on her mind at all times, and she has this experience. And it's funny what she expresses. Like, she saw a black cluster inside herself, and she told it, "Get the fuck out!" And I'm pretty sure people sitting there that were, the nurses and the doctors that were overseeing her were like freaking out. But they don't, they leave them alone. They wait till everything's over before they kind of talk to them. But they're just there for aid. But what she had in the experience was, she said it wasn't her cancer. Maybe you've heard Michael Pollan explain this. It wasn't her cancer because it wasn't in her lung. It was kind of in her stomach. It was like a black mass. It was her fear. And that she told her fear to get the fuck out. And when Michael Pollan went to go write about it in the New Yorker, he kind of wrote this thing of like, oh, her fear diminished. And so the New Yorker fact checkers went to Dina and they said, well, did your fear diminish? She goes, no, Michael got it wrong. My fear completely vanished. It was extinguished. Like, that's how powerful it was. It wasn't just a diminishing, it was gone. So for people who are suffering from cancer, they're on the brink of death and they lose their sense of fear, they can now enjoy the rest of their lives in contentness. They're not thinking about death anymore. And,
satisfaction.
Satisfaction. And it's nothing new, man. I mean, if you study religion, all the mystics have said this: a direct experience of God is, it's necessary for your spiritual and mental health. Even the Buddhists have said this: every sentient being should experience nirvana. Like every sentient being should become enlightened. And we were saying something about your dreams earlier, that you always felt there was a hint towards bettering yourself. You're the highest version or the best version of yourself. Well,
I think John mentioned his stories. Wasn't it his stories?
Yeah. No, I think I heard John say something like that he felt that his dreams were hinting him towards seeing the best version of himself.
Oh, no, that's where I think we got slightly cut off. That was his stories. He was mentioning how in his writing, he was writing a story for 4 months.
Okay. And then, was that it? I was chiming in and out before in the chat because I was trying to figure out how to join you guys, but I thought I heard something like that, and I don't know. I was going to relate it. In a lot of these, when you have these experiences, you often get visions of trying to better yourself, to trying to become, the best version of yourself, and it's real positive. And I don't know if you guys watch The Atheist Experience or Talk Heathen.
Sometimes.
Well, I called in to Talk Heathen just this last Sunday, and or yesterday, or the day before yesterday. It's already past 12, but. I brought up these topics, and there was a study that was dropped on the 23rd of this month. It was at Johns Hopkins. It was a survey study they did involving people who had these type of experiences, either with meditation or with psychedelics, be it DMT, ayahuasca, peyote. They accepted all these accounts into a survey, and they had some atheists in their study, and they're saying that a lot of these atheists, after this experience, they reported, the majority of them reported no longer identifying with atheism. And I talk about this, and I mention it. They weren't necessarily offended, but I don't know.
It should probably be contrasted to something John Vervaeke mentioned in one of his more recent lectures about people who had gone through some kind of experience like this, coming to wildly contradictory conclusions from each other. Some people coming to the conclusion, I know there is a God. Other people coming to the conclusion, I know there is no God.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know if you guys follow this research at all, but I find it interesting. They relate these mystical experiences to all the major religions. It's the mystical. It's the height of what's seen in these visions is a universal phenomenon in consciousness that they see at the very core of all the major religions. I find that very interesting.
Sure, but at the same time, if I remember correctly, there's a lot of talk in the Bible about how a direct encounter with God kills you.
Well, you could experience enough ego death that you don't return, or there's nothing left of you, because death also.
Obviously, you can explain it. I'm not saying you can't. I'm just saying there is absolutely talk about it not being completely positive.
That is true. Like as Jordan mentions, you could have really bad trips.
Yeah, definitely. I don't want to make it sound like it's all roses and rainbows. Because I mean, if you look at the pilot studies, man, that started back in '99, there's still people from that same study that are seeking psychiatric help today that had such a bad experience, during this event. And they do recognize this. It's not the majority of individuals. It is a small percentage, but they see the benefits overlapping the negative aspects. But yes, there are some individuals that do have very hellish experiences, like literally hellish.
Yeah, I think I remember Michael from Vsauce, or we have to include him in the conversation. He did a study where he took the train trolley problem and he actually performed it for the first time in real life. It's on YouTube in originals, and they mentioned how they had to carefully select the applicants of the study to ensure that they don't freeze up, seize, paralyze, or go into a state of shock. I think something similar could be done for these kind of LSD type studies, because I assume it's more based on the person who experiences all the hellish experience than based on.
But
Yeah,
if you go back to the whole actual thing, I still don't see how this gets us anything beyond derived.
derived.
Yeah, derived meaning, as in the meaning we can pick up.
Yeah.
The actual meaning relative to our
Well, another thing I would add about meaning that I like, I don't know if you guys have heard of Alan Watts. He's one of my favorite philosophers, and he would say, in regards to human perception, that type of meaning, the universe is in a way a kind of Rorschach block. I don't know if you've heard that term in psychology, like the ink blot, and we make of it what we want, but intrinsically, in and of itself, it's neither meaningful. But don't confuse yourself, it's neither meaningless. It doesn't have a meaninglessness to it. Neither does it have something that's meaningful. It just is. And I think where people confuse themselves is they're either going to see it as, oh, it's very meaningful, or, oh no, this is all meaningless. Let me commit suicide. I'm going to die. It's nothing matters, because you're seeing it in one way or the other. And when
point that it's about relative to our goals, so it's about the relationship first and foremost.
And I think with these, go ahead, man. I'm sorry.
This is a very interesting critique, offered by the postmodernists, because they say that your perception of reality or meaning is different to my perception of it, and then, as Jordan states, they incorrectly assume that all perceptions of reality are false. But it's a very interesting critique that they pulled up. It's like, how are you so sure that your perception of reality is accurate? Because we have other people who have differing experiences, and they are also very detailed. It's quite interesting, really.
Yeah, no, I agree. Even in these studies, when they say these people have so-called, ultimate, complete mystical experience, or they call it ultimate reality, which they equate to the Brahman of Hinduism, they endorse that the experience is more real than everyday waking consciousness. It's more real than the everyday waking consciousness that we experience right now. That's what they express. The majority of these volunteers, it's and so I do find that aspect interesting. And I don't know if you heard of the physicist Carlo Rovelli. He was I think a 19-year-old when he had LSD, and he had an experience of having this transcendence of space and time. But when he returned, he couldn't tell which experience he was having is more real. Is that more real, the experience outside of space and time, or the one I have right here unfolding in time? That's what drew him to physics, and he became a physicist. He's a real, world-renowned physicist today, and a lot of his topics are towards how modern physics views time, and he's claiming that a lot of his best theories are coming out of that vision he had when he was 19 with the psychedelics.
That is true. Physics is based on laws, that your interpretations of the world. I'm quoting Stephen Hawking here, as he points out the theory. If your theory can accurately explain phenomena and predict it, then that's the theory we're going to be using until someone forms a better explanation and a better prediction. That's why Newton couldn't figure out the pattern of Mars, or was it Uranus? I'm not so sure. His laws of gravity explained everything except that. Then along came Einstein and blah 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 blah. We know what happened afterwards.
My only criticism towards Stephen Hawking is I don't know if he ever had psychedelics, man, because you remember he remained an atheist throughout to his death, I think.
Oh no, I just brought Stephen Hawking because I think his explanation of theory is a pretty good one, because he's trying to summarize what science does in the area of physics. That's the only thing. I have no other comments on any
Can I
of his
just
other
say
beliefs.
those are exactly the same requirements we put on our theories every single day.
Mm, we will-
I think
With a different metric for like determining their viability, because like we,
It has to accurately explain phenomena.
yeah. So, I wanted to go into something you had mentioned earlier, Raymond, that I think it's good to try to figure out like where the differences between and also what you were saying, Trygve, where we're having these derived senses of intense meaning in comparison to the actual. So I think as a singular individual person, we can be too limited within our own capabilities to know everything about even ourselves. And I think
About anything.
about anything. And by being within a social group, something like that, the actual person that I am isn't all located within my own like mind, kind of like from the postmodern conception where our identity is whatever I think myself to be. But it's something also my identity and like my personality is also known within the people that I interact with. So like they can observe me and see how I'm like hypocritical or contradictory to myself. And that's something that I might be blind to just through my regular day-to-day interactions with for things. And so there's a greater degree of identity than just what is known by the individual person themselves.
Yeah.
This is something Paul Vanderklay brings up in some of his videos. Like,
It's a good point.
yeah, something like that.
I know this. I know that was addressed to Raymond, but real quick, I just wanted to add, out if you're familiar with the reality tunnel of Robert Anton Wilson. Oh no, if not, go ahead, Raymond. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, actually, you were making a point, then it got cut off. Please continue.
Yeah.
Well, the idea of the reality tunnel is, everyone starts off from, you could say, an egoic perspective. We were talking about dreams. Another interesting topic that I really like is when you remember entering the first moments of your consciousness, like when you were 3 or 4 years old, like your very, very first memories of your consciousness itself. A lot of people claim they can remember at least back to 3 or 4 years old. Some people say 2. Very rarely do you see people claim 1 or 0, in the womb or something like that. But you have this egoic impression of ever kind of traversing a map, a maze, and it's from the perspective. It's always going to be from the vantage point of your consciousness, and the point in a lot of these religions is that very thing has to die. For you to realize this more ultimate point, that ego that you think is traversing and making its way, that thing has to die for you to have the so-called mystical experiences. And I kind of see them as the inverse of consciousness, like experiencing yourself as all things, like everything that surrounds us. There's a very interesting guru that by the name of Ramesh Balsekar. I don't know if Strick. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's from India. I don't know where you're from, man. I don't mean to offend you. I don't know if you're not from India, but he talks about the revelation of religion in his eyes being the revelation of no free will, And for him, that's kind of a way to address the ultimate. Like, no matter what you do, if you get in a fight, you win or lose, or you go out throughout your life, no matter what happens, it's ultimately preordained in this perspective, and it's preordained by God or Brahman or whatever you want to call it. And that thing, it's kind of like he kind of sees it like an analogy would be a reel in the movie. Like, like you have a movie reel, and then you have the movie displaying on the projection, and it looks like it's happening, unfolding in time, but really the whole reel is already there, and that whole reel encompasses everything. It's God. All your life is already there, unfolded in the movie. But so he's a real interesting guy. Some people come up to him confused, saying, "Well, Ramesh, if everything's predetermined, what do I do?" As he's like, "Well, nothing. You've been doing what you continue what you've been doing anyway, because everything that's been happening has been happening. It's been going on."
It's a good point about determinism and how it works, because you would really notice. But at the same time, that sounds like pantheism, and I don't think everyone is fine with that.
Yes, but I would say from a lot of these people, a lot of these mystics who have this break between the subject-object duality, between them, what they consider as them separate from everything else, they don't deny that everything else. They become one with it, such that when they come back from this experience, they end up with like a kind of panentheistic interpretation of God. They don't see God as some entity like the flying spaghetti monster, or like how it's parodied by atheists, or this magic sky wizard, and like these real naive basically straw man versions of God. And
children's pictures.
Yeah, they have a much more sophisticated understanding. Spinoza had this, Einstein had this. I know Shrik mentioned Einstein. He had a Spinoza understanding of God, and that's what it wasn't. It wasn't just the universe; it was everything in it and beyond. It was all time at all places. It's not just everything we know here right now. What our ego can conceive, it transcended beyond that. It was everything else as well.
Just a point of correction. You mentioned Brahmin. It's actually in Hinduism. They have a concept of exactly what you're talking about. It's called Brahman. Well, basically, in religion, if you read the Vedas, it says that people won't really understand all this crazy stuff. So first we introduce them as Brahmin, which is actually the deity, like a dude. Like
yes. No. No, I completely understand the distinction. Yes. So what he's saying is that there is a very common misconception in Hinduism. There's a Brahmin and a Brahman. 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 Yeah, that's probably the correct pronunciation. But the point the point and the distinction is that one is a symbolic representation. One is the actual direct experience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is a very important point, because basically, I think this is going to derive meaning and actual meaning, because lots of consider it as actual meaning, and then everything that is based around it is derived meaning, and it kind of tells you that. So I find that kind of...
Yeah, I love that point, man. It reminds me of what I was mentioning earlier about Parmenides, the way of truth and the way of opinion. The way of truth understands direct experience. The way of opinion confuses the symbolic representation as the direct experience.
It sounds like we're coalescing on the point that the actual and derived meaning are really useful categories.
Yes, they are. I think they are. I think they always have been. I think they've probably been, eternal principles throughout all time. That's why Carl Jung can mention them as archetypes, because they transcend culture. They're things that occur in all times and all places.
Mm-hmm. Now, I suppose John Buck has to defend his proposition, which is very close to it, but it's not quite the same.
No, I think that's probably a good tying up of everything. Yeah, I guess my only addition is one of the ways in which we determine whether or not our derived meaning was actual or was merely just derived is how effective it was put into practice. So, like, you can have certain, let's say, moral assumptions about the human nature or something like that, and then you can put those beliefs into practice. And I think like that's one of the common disagreements, or that's one of the common arguments against communism is that it runs off of a conception of human nature that is inconsistent with reality, where man requires incentives to
function.
To function, and also so as not to man has an amount of selfishness and greed within it that can be put into practice towards the betterment of everyone else.
I think that it's biologically ordained. Like you literally, your body, your organism is like telling yourself to survive by thinking for yourself first over other organisms. It's a Darwinian way of looking at it, but that's also another critique against communism, and it's been touted. So
and anyway, that was like how I use or how I think of the actionable versus non-actionable is the conception of man's let's say inherent nature and altruism is a belief that it is only actionable up to a certain degree within reality. Like you cannot build a governmental system with that belief in mind. Yeah, you might be able to.
Family, but not in the government.
Yeah, exactly. Like when you're interacting with your own family, you can have this conception of human goodness for all these people because there is such a high degree of shared context that basically all the humans within that certain context are inherently good to a certain degree because they all have a shared kind of identity with each other, and so they're going to be doing things for the good of one another because they are in a way sharing in that identity and basically doing it for themselves of that same identity.
I'll be careful with saying that they're doing it because it's shared identity, because that sounds a lot like conflict theory to me, which I think is plainly wrong.
I've heard of that. Yeah, this is more, I guess, going off of Jonathan Haidt's kind of group sorts of like moral values and things like that. And so by having shared values, people are able to cooperate and organize within each other, with each other.
I might even go as far as to say by believing you have shared values.
Sure.
Because it's possible to think you don't have shared values when you do, and it's possible to think you have shared values and be wrong.
Oh, sure. Yeah, like I guess that is kind of the first way in order to cooperate with your enemies. It's by first assuming that there is some sort of shared goal between you and your enemy, and then acting off of that with the hope, I guess, that by doing so you can create this merger between each other, which might not.
It's always a bet.
Say it again.
It's always a bet, a leap of faith.
Yeah, exactly. We're always acting off of limited knowledge and uncertainty for the future outcomes that we will.
John, to clarify what you said, you don't mind if I ask you something real quick?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so I follow the Atheist channel, the Atheist Experience channel. I'm a fan, but I've noticed Matt Dillahunty has this view that he expresses. I don't know if you share this with him, but he talks about completely that he wants religion to completely end. He wants to see religion kind of banished from the planet, but he caveats that with he'll say. I don't want people to. I don't want to make it a law, and people are. I'm just gonna make people force them to give up their religion. He wants people to come to it on their own terms, and I guess he kind of sees logic as being a stepping stone towards everyone just accepting kind of atheism. And I guess what I'm asking is, do you conceive of that? Do you agree with that? Or do you see other alternatives, like maybe, religion evolving, religion taking more of a modern, being shaped by modern culture, people going their own directions. How do you perceive the future? You know, I think that's real relevant to what you were talking about.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know. You probably missed it, but just sharing our kind of like very basic metaphysical beliefs between ourselves. Trygve is an atheist. Cafe or Raymond is I guess agnostic, and I'm kind of a theist. So I would say.
I'm sorry, I didn't know you were a theist.
No, it's all right.
That's cool.
But I am interested in this, and I am trying to like work towards that better future where the metaphysical disagreements aren't the things that are tearing us apart. And so I think that our conceptions of religions are going to become much more tied within Darwinism.
Oh my God! Hey, man, you make much more sense to me now because I just want to. I'm not. This is not a criticizing comment. When I see you speak, you always have your eyes tilted up as though you're groping for the next thing to say. But I admire that now because now I see you're coming from the vantage point of a theist. And yes, from trying to define these things, and man, it's real hard. In my opinion, it's much easier for the atheists to say, "Oh, I reject all that. I mean, it's meaningless nonsense." It's way easier for them to say that than to try to actually make sense of it and put logic into it. And I feel that's what you're doing. And when you're looking up, you're not just trying to bullshit your way through the conversation. You're actually, you're not just groping for nonsense. You're groping for actual, things that actually make sense relative to this topic.
Looking at the feet of God, that could be.
Yeah, they make sense relative to these topics, man. That makes so much more. See, I thought you were an atheist. I'm like, what is this dude doing? Like, why is he so unsure and unconfident of himself? Like.
Can I ask you something, Trygve? What does that say about me?
Well, you're a little different. I feel okay now. I realize you're also a theist.
No, he's an atheist.
Oh, he's an atheist. Oh my God. I got everything backwards, man. I'm fucking backwards, man. Man, you're the atheist. Wow. Well, I found that some of the things that John was bringing up, you gave repetitive responses. Like he was looking for an answer, and you were just like, "Well, that's as far as we can get." That's why I wanted to chime in. I was like, "Well, wait a minute. That's not as far as we can get. We can get a whole lot further than that. We can go to infinity." Like come on.
Not with certainty. That's the point.
Well, I mean, that's
is different from a lot of the early 2000s new atheists that you might see online from those types of channels as well. He's very much a follower of kind of Peterson. I don't know. Yeah. You're familiar with Jordan Peterson?
Of course. Hell yeah. Of course.
So yeah, he has some very interesting kind of pragmatically derived metaphysics as well that he kind of works off of. He's quite the interesting interlocutor.
Oh well, cool, man. I'm used to it, dude. I've called, like I said, I called into the atheist experience pretty frequently. I've done it. I try to make it like once a year because when I first brought up these topics and the research, Matt was completely unfamiliar. It flew over his bald head. No, I'm joking. I just like a fucking fun. But no, he admitted that he wasn't familiar. He's like, call in next time. Maybe I'll look up on it or whatever. So I had been calling in, and I was the first caller, first person to get hung up on this year. First episode, first caller to get hung up on by Matt Dillahunty this year. Look it up, man. If you want to see it, it's like 90,000 views right now. Like.
Wait, what did you do? Did you insult his bald head?
Yeah. Well, I've been trying to go. I live in Texas, so I've been trying to go down to Houston to give Matt about 16 dry grams of mushrooms. But he won't take it up.
Okay. You're trying to get him to experience the ego dissolution.
Yeah,
I think that Because Matt has been really arrogant so far during his discussion.
But I think that's the point, whether it's through psychedelics, whether it's through meditation or asceticism, people are trying to look for different ways to dissolve the ego. And that's what modern spirituality is about. That's what Michael Pollan said. He's like, once he had this experience, it wasn't about an argument between the supernatural and the material reality. For him, spirituality became ego and non-ego. It became the dissolution of the ego. That's what it meant for him after he had this experience.
I can just out here. I think you're looking at it from a modern spirituality lens, which I believe, from what I've read and seen from different sources, suffers from something that Rupert Sheldrake called ABC, anything but Christian. Which, as an atheist, it's not a very big problem for me, but I just know that it seems like there are people suggesting that you can have your cake and eat it too.
Yeah. Oh man, Rupert Sheldrake is fucking awesome, man. I mean, did you know that his first dose of DMT was through like Terence McKenna, and Terence McKenna advocated what he called the heroic dose, and I think he even dosed Rupert with a heroic dose of mushrooms. So yeah, man, he's definitely out there, man. He's definitely out there.
This conversation turned from a discussion about meaning to becoming Joe Rogan's.
Well, it might be that I think the entirety of culture is naturally navigating towards not just Joe Rogan or psychedelics, but I think the main point, not to obfuscate it, is the dissolution of ego. That's what has to be emphasized, and it's not.
I think you get that from the Eastern traditions primarily, because it seems to me that the Western tradition says something else.
Well, no, I disagree. I study Western religion. You could look into quietism or theoria or the beatific vision. There's henosis. There's many terms in Western theology that you might not be familiar with. There is an esoteric side to all the major religions, not just the Eastern religions, but definitely the Western religions too. Islam, the Sufi mystics, in Judaism you have this Shekinah, or what's called a Sekel Mufla in Judaism. There is an esoteric side at the very core, the nascency of these religions.
I think what Trygve is trying to mention is that when you look at Western religion from a regular perspective, it doesn't seem very inclined towards ego.
Yes. No, I agree. I think there is. I consider it to be part of the core veins of it. I think it dried out, and what you have are sects that are branched out. And the reason why you have so many denominations is because you have sects upon sects, not SEX, but SECTS. That we're branching out from trying to understand religion solely on scripture, solely on intellect, solely on trying to understand the written word, scholasticism. And that's culminated in what we know today as apologetics. But that's trying to understand religion through your intellect as opposed to trying to understand religion through direct experience. It's a major distinction. And those religions where mystical experience dried out became religions of apologetics, which branched out into myriads and myriads of ideas of how people interpret God, because they weren't trying to interpret it through direct experience. And so when you don't have a direct experience, then you develop what's called eisegesis. Your biases seep in, and that's how you have all these conflicting and contradictory interpretations. But when really, if you go back to the main root of the vein, you have them all outpouring from mystical experience. That's the main original founding thing about the very founders of the major religions. You can consider Plotinus, Gautama, the original Buddha, Christ. If you consider he was the real person, some people don't even believe that. And going back before that, Mani of Manichaeism and so forth, on to the very early mystery religions, to shamanism, to it's been going on for centuries, for millennia, since time immemorial.
Like that's a very Hegelian point. It's like where we had one system take dominant, and then we had the opposite of the system is en route. Now we might have a synthesis of both systems.
Yes.
The core of what you're saying sounds like it's something like what I understand as the aesthetic ideal following Nietzsche. And you probably know his idea about the aesthetic ideal, that it was essentially self-denial in the service of attaining truth.
Yes. Well, I mean, the point in idealism was that consciousness is primary. It's the very essence. It's primacy of being. In other words, they consider it eternal. The consciousness. There was never a point that consciousness never was, and a lot of people have a hard time wrapping their minds around that because well, how is consciousness at the Big Bang, or how is a rock consciousness? And we're not saying. I don't think these religious people are saying that a rock is conscious in the way that a human is consciousness. Of course not. You can't talk to a rock. But I think they're saying a little bit something deeper than that. That the basis of matter is a type of a fabric that is conscious itself. And it's not the consciousness that we know, the very perplexed consciousness and complex. It's more of a basic. They call it in Hinduism. It's called Turiya. It's pure consciousness, devoid of thought, devoid of emotion, because it doesn't have those apparatus like we do in our serotonin in our brain, the serotonergic system, or the neurons.
Is it like you call it attention?
I'm sorry, like panpsychism? Is that no? That's not what you said.
I ask, is it better to call it attention?
Attention. I mean, you could say that, but I think even that word kind of leads people astray. It is hard to talk about. Pure consciousness, is one thing to say. It's quite another thing to try to interpret in this context. And but I really think it's kind of like an elementary, like a basic. It's devoid of thought. It's devoid of emotion. It's just a kind of basic fabric, and that's where life springs from. When matter complexifies, that's the view of the religious view of consciousness. Because if you take on the atheist perspective, that eventually somehow matter coalesces itself by physics, and then you have it emerging from the human brain. That's the popular view. That's what you have to make the distinction between.
As an objective person, I tend to disagree with that view because the evidence of such has not been replicated. It's like science has a problem. If you don't have data in science, you can't have any observations, you can't have predictions, you can't have theory. So you might as well just chuck it in the bin. No one knows. You have no data.
Well, if you can't have consciousness in the first place, you can't even have something to examine data. I think it goes. Yeah, it's a real deep argument, man, and I think that's why it's not really, no one. I'm not saying these things are true. I'm just saying that's how it's thought of in these religious concepts. Like, I'm not arguing for it. A lot of atheists, or even like Richard Dawkins says, when I die, my brain ceases to exist. Therefore, my consciousness blinks out. I'm gone forever. It's like deep sleep. How does he know that? Has he died, explored death, and come back to let us know this is what happens after death?
Yeah, he's taking the step to one. That's true.
I don't think he knows. I don't think he really knows. I think that's just a narrative that the atheists say because that's their popular understanding of death.
I think what the new atheists made a mistake was they treated science as if it was the replacement for God or religion. And science is just a process.
A lot of people seem to do that, yeah.
Yeah, science is just a process. I mean, I have to make that clear. It's just a method of analysis. You can't make science itself critiques science, so that tells you how much of a non-mode of being it is. And continue, John. I interrupt you.
You can probably describe science very efficiently as something like a more intentional and rigorous version of what we do every single day, all the time, to evaluate phenomena.
Exactly. It's an upscale version of that with increased complexity to allocate for all the possible realities. That's one way. But John, we interrupted you. You were about to make a point.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think that as people and as creatures, we face so much uncertainty and chaos within our lives that we have to have something to kind of place assurance within or to place confidence within. And I think like where let's say as you brought up, Cafe, how for the people that have had these types of deep spiritual and meaningful experiences, that is where they can place all of their confidence with it. Whereas for a lot of people, say, in the church that haven't had these types of experiences, that their confidence gets placed upon the byproducts from that. So the text themselves, and the text itself becomes primary for them, and that is where they derive all confidence and trust within. And then kind of a similar way where having a firm understanding of the world as facts and laws and rules and equations, all of that, having this deep, firm knowledge about what the world is and like what will occur from that. That is something that you can place a high amount of confidence within as well, and in order to sustain at least a certain amount of anxiety, perhaps.
No, I agree with that. I mean, like, you have to remember I think they're deriving from the same source. Whether it's mystical experience or whether you're trying to interpret scripture. The only issue I think that the mystics had with interpreting scripture, that you are being led in a direction. I mean, you want to be led in the most right and accurate, truthful direction, that your moral compass can lead you in. And when you're interpreting things through ideas, there's a chance to be led astray. Whereas if you have a direct experience, it becomes almost an impossibility. And if you don't mind, man, I would like to quote Adam Watts, man. He said, "I think the Bible ought to be ceremoniously and reverently burned every Easter. We need it no more because the Spirit is with us. It's a dangerous book, and to worship it is, of course, a far more dangerous idolatry than to bow down to images of wood and stone. Because nobody in his senses can confuse wooden images with God, but you can very easily confuse a set of ideas with God because concepts are more rarefied and abstract. And when people talk about God, they talk about their ideas of God. And ideas, you can't knock on them, you can't hit them with a stick. They're something that are amorphous. They're, open to interpretation. And if you, in each individual Christian that interprets religion through eisegesis, through direct intellect, they're going to have their very unique definition of God. Whereas these mystics are referring to one and the same thing. They're not referring to any idea of their own. They're not referring to something that they thought of. They're just pointing to an experience, and that's all they could do because that's their perspective. That's how they learned it. It's a direct experience.
This, in the sense of a biological argument, that religion is built into us, and we all have certain pathways or certain ideas that are rooted into us archetypally. As Jung would say, archetypes, as a biologist would say, chemical pathways or
Yes.
genes. We could have like different discussions about that, but I guess we need a bit more of the background knowledge to fill that in.
I feel like you were saying it's like a double-edged sword, man. We can talk about God, we can talk about the idea of God, we can talk about the experience of God, but one of those things is going to lead you astray. I've met people who tell me because I've had this experience myself. That's why I speak so fervently about it. But I've spoken to people who tell me, "How do you know that you weren't experiencing the devil?" Like, oh my God, this universal potential in us that is enlightening, that shows us complete love. How do you know you weren't being deceived by the devil? Man, okay, well, if that's the case, then everyone has them at their core a complete lie.
It's the Descartes problem.
Which I don't agree with, but it just shows the capacity that people have to deny it. And I really believe like an atheist can probably have this experience for him or herself and deny it, just stick their head in the middle of the couch and burrow it and just, swim against the waves that are of tsunamis that are coming against them and just completely deny it to the very bitter end. And, and come out of that experience like, oh, I made it. My atheism is triumphant. And completely missing the point because they spent the whole experience denying it, instead of allowing themselves to fall into the vortex and let the waves just take them adrift. And I think that's what faith really means. It's the trust to let go of your ego.
In archetypal terms, you could call it to fall into the arms of the Great Mother or something like that.
Yes, yeah, that's another metaphor for it. Oh yeah.
I also, you could say, it's confronting your shadow. For example, some people do that when they take their LSD or what. They confront
Or
things.
the individual Atman falling, the droplet falling into the ocean of Brahman and becoming one with it. And there's so many metaphors, so many. You can find them throughout all the major religions. I assure you, if you're really paying attention.
Not critiquing it, but that's a good point that people. How do you know you're not experiencing something that you have to defeat in order to achieve the
Yes.
next set of goals? That's a good critique. I'll agree with that in the sense that well, some people do stick their head in the sand, but some people who have this experience would say, "Well, I believe with you, but what happens if you faced your own ego in the sense that your shadow?"
And that's what the Buddha was saying all along, that people, what they're doing is they're clinging to ego. That's the very thing that's preventing them from having the experience. It doesn't matter how much DMT you take or how much ayahuasca you drink or how much mushrooms you eat. It's not going to matter if you're denying it all the way through and covering your eyes and holding your ears shut and,
So
I guess
if we look at it from a more critical, let's say, skeptical lens, we still don't get anything to say for certain that these similar experiences people have had are anything more than derived. Which is it's a very unpopular point with this crowd, I'm sure. But if we're going to be honest about it, we don't know anything more than that. People experience this.
You would have to explain what you mean by derived, because like I said, what they express at the height of these experiences, a collapse of all time. So there is the word derive or derivation. It makes no sense. It has no meaning in that experience. There is nothing to derive from something from that. Everything is really literally one.
Only if you assume that the experience is 100% accurate.
I didn't catch that. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Can you repeat that?
Only if you assume that their experience is 100% accurate.
Sure. Like I said, it's the same with the person that accused me. Well, how do you know the devil wasn't deceiving you? And the thing is,
yeah, it's not the same thing, but it's a point of trying to make sure we don't say anything for certain that we don't know for certain. It's a matter of trying to live up to the aesthetic ideal of finding truth.
Yeah.
Through self-denial. You really want to believe it, but I don't think we can go there for certain.
I would say, do you question whether you're being too skeptical?
Well, I did know somebody that had a drug problem, and he would go. I don't know exactly. I think it was like Robitussin. He would take a lot of it, and he would have these deep philosophical conversations with people, and feel like he was just always in that constant flow state. And it was him almost kind of like feeding his ego in a way, but also it was over time he was able to realize that this was inauthentic for what, even though it experientially it had such a fullness and meaningfulness within it, but it was just kind of his. It was kind of a self-derived delusion, I think, for him, that was only recognizable through the people that he was having conversations with, and from himself, from a future kind of perspective then.
Yeah.
Which,
at the end of the day, I don't see how these things can be tested other than through living the personalities they create.
mm-hmm.
So here I actually support your idea of being actionable.
Ta-da! Yeah. Both of the definitions working in tandem with each other in order to try to get closer towards whatever reality lies behind them.
At the end of the day, we're just looking at two different kinds of distinctions to make within meaning as implication of action. And the point of making distinctions is that they're useful. So they're both useful. I think based on how much I've been using in this discussion, my distinction is more useful.
I'll concede it. All right. And I think that's probably a good place to stop. It's almost 3 a.m. for me here. And
Yeah, boy, oh boy, that's late.
Oh, John, geez.
I haven't breakfast yet.
no, that's all right. I had a Red Bull, so I'll probably be up for a little bit.
Remind me of my. He always is awake to watch football matches at this time, and he just lives on pure Red Bull. I keep telling him tonight, he doesn't listen to me. Oh God. F in the chat for John.
By the way, is Adam still there? I can't see the chat.
Yes, I'm here. It was really badass, man. I love chilling with y'all. If y'all want to invite me again, please. I really liked all of y'all, everything that everyone said. Hey, man, John. Before you go, man, I was gonna ask you, would you ever consider, taking a psychedelic?
I don't know. That's kind of the thing, because like both my parents were like hippies, and they had quite a good amount of experiences with that, and even bad experiences that kind of caused them to fall away and lose their grounding for where they were going. And so I'm I guess more apprehensive towards that. I've known people like that did mushrooms and things like that, but I don't know. I'm apprehensive just because I know that there's I guess vulnerabilities within me, and like my genes and all of that towards falling victim to that.
Yeah.
But I'm always definitely like very interested in these types of conversations. Like I read Huxley and different people that have to do with these types of things. So
it's funny that you mentioned that, because you're the one that mentioned Michael Pollan, and he, he's an older dude, obviously, and he had this conversation with himself. He was like, well, I want to write this book, but at the same time, I have to take these high doses of psychedelics. Should I not take them? If I do this at this obscure place with this obscure person, are they going to call the ambulance if I start having some kind of convulsions or something? And so he went through all these like hangups throughout the night, and he at the end he realized it was his ego preventing him from doing the experience. Like it was his own ego making excuses. Like, hey man, you have a book to write. What are you doing? Aren't you curious? What's gonna go on? And so he ended up doing it. And he's in his 60s, man. Like that's not. I mean, apparently he was confident enough to handle it in his 60s, and he did it. He didn't do it legally, man. He signed up for Johns Hopkins, but they didn't accept him. I think he didn't pass the the screening. But so he opted to do it illegally. So for the book, and so you may have heard of him, but even though he's like on CNN and all these real very public places, he is talking about illegal participations that he partook in. Like he's talking about taking DMT, ayahuasca illegally, mushrooms, and but the thing is, he overcame that fear, and ultimately it's even bigger inside the experience. And yeah, sure, man, they do consider it a life-changing experience, and I respect your decision of, hey, I'm gonna stay off that for a little bit. But I don't know. It's one thing I find interesting. To me, for theists or atheists, like I'm like, hey, why? Joe Rogan would say, hey, there's a God room right there. You don't want to go in the God room? No, I'm fine, man. I'll stay out of that room. Whoa, shit. You're an atheist. You wanted to meet God, right? He's right there. Don't you want to meet him? No, I think I'll kick back. I don't want to do DMT. That's what confuses me. And so, I don't know, man. We'll end it there. I really love the conversation. Thank you for inviting me, brothers. Oh yeah.
All right. We're getting a couple stragglers in the chat that have just popped in, and they're curious at what our conclusion was to our conversation. So like the definitions of meaning and how. Okay, so we kind of built off of Jordan Peterson's meaning as implication for action. And then from that, there is the actual meaning, or there's derived meaning used from Trygve's terms. And so actual meaning is, I guess, the signal that is being portrayed from reality rather than a
Relative to your goals.
okay, yes, that are correlatory and relative to your goals, rather than just subjectively perceived meaning that are relative to your goals, but are only, I guess, illusions and not directly or not actually conducive towards achieving those things. So I'm curious about, like, how would placebo effects then fit into that? Because they would certainly be derived meaning, but they are conducive towards, like, well-being and actually achieving
Well,
your
not
end.
necessarily. Placebos can be bad too. They're just derived.
Okay, just derived, but yet they still serve a function towards the goal of healthiness.
Or I would
No,
also
no.
say,
That's towards the goal of happiness.
Say again, Trygve.
I mean,
They create a function because the mind is a powerful thing. Its beliefs impact how things happen too.
Mhm.
It impacts the neurochemicals after all. So obviously placebo effects happen, and they are the consequence of derived meanings. And they're not necessarily positive, they're not necessarily negative. They can be both. So I wouldn't say it has anything to do with the goal at all at that point. It's just derived, and that impacts things and positive placebo effects.
I would add that there is a hot focal point that the research emphasizes, and that's that these research with psilocybin are double-blind studies. They are placebo and psilocybin. So you're either, if you participate in the study, you're either going to get a placebo dose or you're going to get the psilocybin. And when what they distinguish is when you have the psilocybin. Of course, they say you would be able to distinguish the psilocybin and the placebo very quickly, but and they do. I mean, if they're really honest, researchers do say, like, obviously, you're gonna be able to tell whether you got a dose of Ritalin or a high dose of psilocybin, and what they derive from the experience. Man, I'm losing it, man. I'm sorry, man. I had a trail, but I lost the thread.
No, it's probably good. So yeah, there's certain placebos that are very minimal. So, like, you're a young kid and you buy fake beer and you drink those beers with your friends, thinking that they're real, and then you have the fake effects of drunkenness.
Oh yes. Thank you. Thank you. That helped. So placebo. So if you get the placebo in the research, then you kind of report this kind of nothing burger experience. Like nothing really happened. And so when you take the psilocybin, a lot of people report, like I said earlier, like they report an unconditional love, and that becomes the focal point of the moral compass, and that's what they see intrinsically in the major religions. And so if if anything outside of that, in my opinion, if you're not going by that, then you're interpreting religion through intellect. You're seeing everything, and okay, even beyond that. So I'm not criticizing intellectual interpretation of religion. I think people are on the right track with that. Maybe they might be led astray, but if you consider atheists, they have no compass whatsoever. They have to kind of develop it on their own. It becomes, then the universe becomes, like I said earlier, the Rorschach block, where it's the ink blot, where people project their own meaning or meaninglessness. They can project one or the two. And so I think outside of having these experiences that have been emphasized in religion, that's what people end up describing meaning as. They end up either developing their own meaning or seeing life as meaningless because the universe then is seen as a Rorschach block where you can project anything you want to onto it.
Yeah, this is something Peterson brings up in his book 12 Rules for Life, that you can adopt a framework where everything is meaningless just because everybody's going to die. The universe is going to go into entropy and fall short into nothingness. All of energy.
Yes.
And there's also the framework that you can adopt of, say, complete materialism. Like, say, matter is the primary component of the universe that is inert, unconscious.
Non-conscious. Yeah.
That's the framework that you've adopted with this element of reality held up as most primary in respect to everything else. And then there's also, let's say, the framework that you can adopt of phenomenology, where all experience is most primary, or even like certain subjective experiences of meaning as being most primary. Like, that's kind of Jordan Peterson's primary star, I guess, that he uses for his work. It is where things are most meaningful. That is where you're supposed to be, like, working towards. That's kind of his framework for life, the 12 rules for life. Meaning is kind of they're central to that.
Meaning could be adopted by responsibility or such.
Say that again.
Meaning could be adopted by responsibility and by turning chaos into order. That was one of the points he made. But it goes beyond that.
Or I like how Jordan Peterson phrases it as like your highest, whatever the highest meaning to you is in your reality, and this could apply to even atheists. You know, he considers that God, and I think that's why he sometimes doesn't call atheists because he's like, if you have that, then you're not an atheist. And you know, he's been criticized of that view, but yeah, he has been saying this, and I don't know. For me, you know, Jordan Peterson mentions mystical experiences, and he talks about these things. You know, he has lectures where he goes on and on about the research going on at Johns Hopkins, but and he also admits to taking psychedelics himself. So, you know, I always wonder, like, man, because he's always seemed to me a guy that he has a stance, but he's never too clear on it. And so because he's kind of evasive in that way, a lot of people can't pin him down. Like, hey, what are you saying, man? Are you like this fundamental? Are you this Christian? Or are you this? Are you perennialist? Do you believe that all religions share the same truth? Or what the fuck are you saying, man? You know?
I won't deny that. But my point is that sometimes he's not sure about it himself. In his most recent interview on the question of God, he said out clearly that he just doesn't know anymore.
That's what I'm saying. That he had a real interesting letter from someone who had an ayahuasca experience that claimed to saw Jordan Peterson at the height of the vision. You know, and the whole trip for them was Jordan Peterson. It was marrying religion and science. You know, he was like gonna be the prophet that married religion and science and the vision, and Jordan Peterson, and she wrote like, you know, this is what you're doing here. This is what you're doing here on the planet. And Jordan Peterson was like, well, I would like to know what the fuck I'm doing here. Like, I've been trying to figure this shit out myself. You know, like, I thought it was a hilarious response, man. But it's on YouTube, man. Just type in like Jordan Peterson ayahuasca, you'll find it.
But at this point, I think we perhaps should continue answering those comments. So we got into actionable arrived. You should probably explain non-actionable and actionable again. And
Yes.
then I think perhaps the rest will have to be saved for another discussion.
Right. Okay. So yes. Okay. So this is maybe where I'll come in conflict with yours again, because I think that even when there is a non-actual signal being perceived by the subject, this can be a more actionable belief And
You're lagging really bad on my side. I don't know if it's everywhere else, but there's some big problems with the screen. So can you try again?
yeah, sure. You sound fine for me. Maybe I'll lower my bandwidth, I think. I'll probably.
I think there might be a problem with Raymond's channel or something. I don't know.
Yeah, there's a bit of a buzz from Raymond's mic that's kind of been consistent.
Means
Yeah,
I'm wrong.
especially when you're talking too, John. I don't really hear it when Cafe is talking or when Raymond is talking even.
Raymond, are you able to mute yourself when you're not talking?
Oh, sure, I can.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so okay, right. The different having the dichotomy between, or maybe not a dichotomy, but the different categories of actual and derived. I think actionable and non-actionable might serve a greater utility, because there are instances where non-actual perceived meaning provides a greater amount of actionable practices than let's say the actual, in quotation marks, meaning that is signified from the universe itself towards you, or whatever it is that you're interacting with.
The sum of everything else, let's say.
Especially because of the limitations to our perceptions, that we're able to actually derive the signal itself for us. Now, this is hard to really get into without a clear example, I think.
Well, I mentioned earlier the philosophical absolute, and what can be actualized can be what can be manifest in the material reality. But when you think about it in your mind, when you try to conceptualize that, you can have a concept that corresponds with reality, or you can have an abstract idea that doesn't necessarily correspond to reality, and that's where it starts breaking up and it starts becoming vague. But what manifests in the reality is self-evident, and that can't be confused for anything else. And you can, that's one thing that the Greek philosophers considered actualized. And to the degree that you can understand what can actualize in your conceptual ideas, that's the way of truth that Parmenides talked about, as opposed to the way of opinions, which goes off the rail of physics, that is a complete abstraction, is magical thinking, that's the opposite to that. And it's very hard to reconcile those two inside consciousness, because there's so many vagrances, there's so many nuances.
I think, Cafe, that what you're talking about as actualization is very different, and actualizing things is very different from what I'm talking about as actual meaning.
Yeah,
which is again what is signaled. And
yeah, what was
just to be clear here, I think the reason why I don't have a problem with what you're objecting to, John, is because I think we should always keep in mind that we don't know our goals.
Yeah,
we have many goals we don't realize we have at any given time.
Right. And I think I have a good
a
good example to kind of go off of that we've actually already mentioned earlier, like how I was saying the story that I wrote, that I later kind of was able to kind of see myself through it. That was during the process of writing it. I never had this character correlate, or I never had this character intentionally set up as an analogy for my own character. It was only after having read this story was I able to kind of place myself into that character's perspective, and then see the implicit, or only then could I derive meaning from that. And I think that's kind of like how it is for a lot of things. Like when we watch a movie is never directly about its relation to our own personal lives, but rather we are imposing our own personal lives upon that movie through metaphor. and seeing how the character in that movie would deal with the events and the problems with our own lives, and then using that for helping us in strategizing for dealing with our own problems. And I think like all of those things are non-actual, but are only derived, but they are certainly more actionable than non-actionable. Do you get what I'm saying?
See, I think the meaning that has been derived previously when it is signaled further is also actual. It's just actual as a product of derived.
So, okay, so let me get this straight then. So, is actual meaning, let's say linear, where there is some sort of signal being output, then the receiver inputs that signal, and then receives meaning from that. That would that be like an actual meaning rather than say there's no signal being output, but still there through the person's own, let's say, projections onto that object itself.
Can I add to that metaphor?
Yeah, sure.
I would say, you have the projections from the stories, like you said. You can get the gist, from these stories, and it's not something that's actual. It's meaning that you can benefit in your life, but it's not something that you can point to that's so-called quote unquote actual.
It's basically real.
Yes, and so if you're going. If you're gonna go extend that metaphor a little bit further, you're not just talking about. God damn it, man! It's pretty late for me. I'm sorry, man. I had something, but I completely it fell off the tip of my tongue.
Mm-hmm. But I wanted to ask you, Trygve. So, in your understanding of actual meaning, is it where there is signal actually being output from the object itself in some way?
Well, not from the object per se, but from the outside, if you will. Not from you.
Okay, so, okay, say, like say for a cat, how when a cat raises the hair on the back of its body, this is done as kind of a signal towards potential predators or prey, or even just fellow cats that, hey, I'm dangerous. This is kind of like a animal social signal that's being put forward. And I can see how that is, let's say, an actual signal being put forward through the object or the creature themselves.
Okay. I think I have a way to make a distinction.
Mm-hmm.
So you have that this a signal from the animal or reading from the book. Any secondary, I would say, reverberation from some source, and that's why you're saying you derive from it, right? But I don't know if you've heard of this analogy in Hinduism with Brahmin, where they say they compare Brahmin to like the radio, the car stereo in your car, right? When you hear the radio, you hear the different voices, you hear the music, you hear the drums, you hear the guitars, so on and so forth, right? But you're not actually hearing radios and drums and cars. All these sounds, or the radio voice, all these sounds are deriving from one single source, the diaphragm of the speaker in your car. And so what you're actually listening to, when in Hinduism they say Maya. When you look at the external reality, it may look like different things, or I'm seeing water, sky, wind, but what you don't realize that they're all emanating from one single source, and that's what they call Brahman. And so you may see all these manifestations and patterns in the material reality unfold before your eyes, but what the Hindus say when they mean Brahman is all permutations that could ever unfold. It's already all there. It's all contained. It's what you see is just a slice of that eternity, and Plato called it the moving image of eternity. You're doing a cross section of something that's already complete and infinite and eternally always there. It's complete and it can't be transcended. It is transcendence itself, and that's what the mystics report or claim that they experience.
The image of the radio is certainly a good one. I hope it illustrates what the distinction is.
So how would you respond then to my example, Trygve, of, let's say, the cat outputting a signal of like, hey, I'm dangerous, and then let's say the other cat that kind of sees this and cowers from it. This is, for that other cat, there's this implicit meaning that's being derived through the actual actions and characteristics of this cat that's trying to make it look larger and more dangerous. Would that be an example of, let's say, actual signal and meaning being accurately portrayed between the two creatures there?
Yeah, I think so. But I suppose we could also make the point that when you talk about things that clearly have an intent with what they're doing, such as other humans, or for that matter, cats.
Yeah.
Probably worth remembering that the actual signal can be faked.
Yeah, that's also it. Okay, so that's interesting, and it's also the case that sometimes we're signaling without even our own awareness.
Yeah,
so
and the signal can be interpreted in many ways. I know I keep on bringing up this distinction between like what you perceive and what's experienced in the mystical experience, because what you perceive is separate from what the mystics describe as beyond perception. It's not something you see with your eyes. It's something that's glimpsed in the mind's eye. And so, it's very different from what you see. And so when you're talking about perception of like what you see an animal do, or they're giving signals, animals can interpret that in myriads of ways, just like we interpret other humans in myriads of ways. But when mystics have this experience, there is no misinterpretation. It's all one thing, such that it's almost as though the universe is directly communicating to you through pure light, pattern, love, infinite bliss, and it's all being interpreted in the most lucid and fast, fashion. It's more real than everyday consciousness. It's the most valid and pure thing you could ever understand, and you purely get it through intuition. There is no misinterpretation. There's no misconception. That's the difference. I think that's the primary difference. And as long as you're egoically looking out and groping for things, you're always gonna grope for it. You're always gonna feel, okay, well, should I go this way? Should I go that way? I feel like I'm getting towards the truth this way. With mystics, that there's no issue. They don't dither like that. They already see the pathway. That's the difference, I think. Like there's one path of groping for it, and you may be on the most part in the right direction, but mystics don't even deal with that. They just walk. And man, I'm sorry, man. It's really late for me. I really have to go. I really love the conversation. I love talking to both of you guys, man. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for joining.
I hope you mean both three.
I'll see you, man. Thank you.
See ya.
Yeah. Did you want to add anything, Raymond? Oh, yeah.
I believe I have annoyed everybody enough on this chat.
Oh no.
Huh?
I'm joking. But I think you guys have got like a good enough discussion in summary of what went on, because we had lots of tangents, and I don't know why we started smoking psilocybin all of a sudden for some reason. But hey, it was pretty useful.
With mystical experience at cafe, apparently.
Sorry, I didn't hear you. Can you say that again?
It's apparently always mystical experiences with cafe.
Yeah, he's very high in agreeableness. You can just tell from his personality there.
Ron is becoming a psychologist. Using
Yeah.
I could see this is a good conversation, except I believe it would have been like you two guys needed a lot more fleshing out to do with the meaning and stuff. It would have been much more interesting if we continued that conversation.
Yeah. But Okay, so do we want to wrap up then? Maybe I guess
We should
sign off.
probably wrap up.
Need to get some sleep.
Yeah, good idea.
I need breakfast, and you need probably need sleep too.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so you guys want to put out your Twitter accounts?
No, don't follow me. My Twitter is garbage.
You can find me at Curious Entity on Twitter, NTT. That is.
Yeah, so the word
Uh,
curious and then NTT, right?
This is not
On
great.
Twitter, I mostly comment on things every now and then, depending on. Well, I'm not most active, but I am somewhat active. You're probably not going to get very much interested depending on the topic because I'm interested in a lot of different things.
And I'll just shout out Raymond's Twitter as well. He's apenguin215 on Twitter.
Oh God, you made the same Benedict Cumberbatch did.
Feel
Penguin.
free to follow him.
Isn't that? Yeah.
This was a fun discussion, guys. I hope we'll have it soon.
Say that again.
This was a fun discussion. I hope we have another.
Yeah, this was good. I'm glad.
Yeah,
we were
we could
able
probably
to.
have several more discussions in the future. Shouldn't be a problem to find we shouldn't have a problem finding a subject matter for more discussions.
Oh yeah, definitely. I want to get into like technology and stuff like that at some point too. Like maybe the prospects of AI and other things like potential future outcomes for our civilizations, things like that. That would be an interesting discussion.
And then there's my dream, which I'm going to talk more about. And just for information, I've also written a kind of story that I looked back on 5 years later and discovered a lot of interesting things about it. Let's just put it that way.
Cool. Yeah. All right. Thank you all for joining. Actually, I have all of our Twitter accounts in the description box below. So anybody that wants to go to that, they're in link form for you guys. So yeah, thanks you both for joining, and thanks also to Cafe for participating in our conversation. And yeah, you all have a good night, good morning, and good afternoon.
Yeah. See ya.